Well, hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Political State Podcast from the Oklahoman. I'm Ben Felder here in the Oklahoman's newsroom podcast studio. And if you've been listening to this podcast since its beginning, which was a couple of years ago, you know we've had a couple of changing co-hosts. Dale Denwalt used to be the Oklahoman's Capitol reporter, joined me in our first year. He's now a technology reporter on the business desk. Justin Wingeter, who covered federal government up until recently, had gone to the Denver Post. But today we have, I guess, a new co-host. I'll go ahead and deputize you with that co-host title now, and that is Carmen Foreman, who's the Oklahoman's new reporter at the Capitol, covering the governor and other legislative issues. Carmen, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, you started on Monday, but it's official now that you're in the podcast studio.
Yep. Now I can't go back. I can't turn around.
Yeah. And you have a great, like I said, Dale was on for a couple of years. Justin was on for 1 year. So you have a good chance to pass them.
To outlast them.
It would only take a couple of years. But glad to have you. Want to get into some of the issues of the week. But first off, just for our listeners, introduce yourself.
Yeah. So I am originally from Norman. I was born and raised there. I went to OU and graduated in 2013. I was an overachiever, so I graduated a little early. And then for the past 5 years, I've kind of just been jumping around between reporting jobs, but typically covering the State House or the Capitol. So I worked at the Roanoke Times in Southwest Virginia for almost 4 years, and I covered the state capitol for them, which is in Richmond. And then most recently, I was in Phoenix, Arizona, covering Arizona Governor Doug Ducey, who I have a feeling that our Governor Kevin Stitt, is a big fan of. So, but now I'm here, and it's great to be back.
Yeah. So obviously, Virginia is an interesting place to cover state politics. It's a pretty big state and close to the nation's capital. Arizona, as you mentioned, some similarities with their governor. What are some of the similarities between Ducey and Stitt?
Yeah, great question. So Governor Ducey and Governor Stitt both have this business background, right? So Governor Ducey is sort of the mastermind behind Cold Stone Creamery, you know, that sort of expensive ice cream store that's really good, but you probably don't eat at very often. Yeah, well, so he basically made all his money off of that. And I think for a time he worked as a distributor for Anheuser-Busch when he was younger. And so it was from that route that he got into state politics. He went on to be Arizona's treasurer, and now he's in his second term as governor. And as we all know, Governor Kevin Stitt also came from sort of a business background.
Not as fun of an industry, though.
Right, exactly.
Ice cream and mortgages. There's kind of a difference, but yeah.
World of differences between those two.
But still business practice. I'm curious, did Governor Ducey, what business concept did he bring? I'm sure when he ran on that platform of being an outsider and being a business leader in the same way that Governor Stitt did. I mean, Ducey was at least in the political sphere somewhat as state treasurer. Stitt had never run for office before. But what were some of the things that Ducey brought in terms of saying, hey, based on my business experience, this is what you can expect from me as governor?
Yeah, so in my first week here at the Oklahoman, I've heard Governor Stitt, or I've seen him quoted in an article saying, you know, government at the speed of business. Well, I heard that phrase about a gajillion times from Governor Ducey, and for both governors, it seems that government at the speed of business is cutting red tape, doing away with bureaucracy, sort of paring down all of the government that exists and that sort of makes things harder for average citizens and especially business people. Anything that they can do to make it easier for businesses to get started or keep going, that's going to be a priority in their minds.
Did you feel like Governor Ducey, was he successful in some of that? And what roadblocks did he find as an outsider now, you know, running government from the inside?
Yeah, he has been relatively successful, I feel. I saw this week he just passed a bill, or the legislature just passed his bill to create universal licensing. So if you move into Arizona, you don't have to get recertified to be, you know, a physical therapist or a nurse assistant or whatever license you had before carries over. But Governor Ducey hit some roadblocks because he has basically had some issues with some of the boards and commissions. He's not a big fan of the boards and commissions because he feels like they just sort of slow down a lot of the processes for businesses trying to get licenses or trying to get up and running. So he's sort of had this quiet behind the scenes war with a lot of those boards and commissions. I could see Governor Stitt sort of having similar problems because I know he wants to shake up a lot of these agencies. And I could see a lot of these agencies saying like, no, don't do that. We need all the manpower we have, or, we are structured this way for a reason, things like that.
Well, now Governor Stitt has the power, at least for the 5 of the bigger agencies, to appoint those directors. Did that same power exist for the governor in Arizona?
Yes.
Okay, and he can appoint members to the boards and commissions that still have some power, even though they're not hiring the director. But the House and the Senate still has appointment power as well. And so some differences may come from there. So I know you're just 1 week on the job and you've been up at the Capitol quite a bit this week, but I'm just curious, just your general reflections of you've had a chance to speak with the governor a couple of times or see him on the trail and at the Capitol. Just kind of any thoughts from the week? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think Governor Stitt is a lot more personable than Governor Ducey. I like Governor Ducey, but he has got his messaging on point, and he rarely ever breaks from his messaging, and it makes him seem very inauthentic, very robotic. Governor Stitt, I saw him drive a tractor to the Capitol this week.
It was your first day, right? Or one of the first days, second day,
yeah. And that was just kind of delightful and very lighthearted, and you could see like there was a personality in there. Not saying that Governor Ducey doesn't have a personality, but Governor Stitt just seems a little more fun and like he's having fun with the job and he's excited to be there. Something else that I noticed, yesterday the House and Senate leaders on both Republicans and both Democrats, they sort of do these unofficial sit-downs with the press that are on the record. And I feel like you would never see that in Arizona. And they do these weekly here or even sometimes twice a week here. And I'm just blown away because like that is a lot more access than I'm used to.
Yeah. Well, that's a good thing. I
yes.
guess.
Keep those up.
Yeah. Well, you talk about Governor Stitt's kind of personality. It's interesting because I think he is still someone that kind of describes the job as being fun. And before you came, I was covering the governor quite a bit, and watching him interact with the public, both in speaking engagements, but also just kind of in smaller formats. And he often kind of just talked about like, I can't believe I'm the governor still. And that's, I think, part of that is a persona. I mean, he's, trying to kind of remind people that he's still an outsider, I suppose. And that's probably smart of him to do, given that's one of the reasons why he got elected. But, he does seem to not have the political playbook down yet. I don't know if he ever will or if he even wants to, but he didn't have that kind of playbook. I mean, he does fall back on his tropes some and some of his talking points, but there does seem to be a little bit more authenticity sometimes when he's speaking.
Yeah, definitely more authenticity. He does seem quite bright, though, I must say. Like, I know that, on the campaign trail, he maybe wasn't as knowledgeable about some policy issues that maybe, House, Senate leaders, lawmakers who've been around for a long time have been, but he does seem like he catches on to things very quickly.
And I would imagine, you have that kind of success in business. There's probably some, a little bit of a light going on upstairs. One thing I constantly heard from people too, during the campaign trail, and I've even heard people repeat this after he's become governor, is that, when he was first trying to get his name out and zero name recognition when he started, I mean, beyond just his kind of circle out in the Tulsa community, he would meet with lawmakers and other people in the political sphere and would ask questions and like take notes in a way that a lot of people were kind of taken aback, because in a lot of political circles, you don't want to reveal that what you don't know. You don't want to come across like, I don't have all the answers. It's very common in political arenas, whether it's one-on-one or on the legislative floor, that you go in thinking, I know everything. I know what I'm talking about. I have all the answers. You don't hear a lot of lawmakers say, I don't know the answer to that, or I don't know this system at all. Can you explain that to me? And he did that in a way that was probably risky, but I've heard some praise from people. Now, of course, he's governor now, so most of those people are going to praise him for it, even if they were taken aback by it. But he does seem willing and open to, he seems to know what he doesn't know, I guess.
Yeah. And having covered 2 gubernatorial campaigns, first in Virginia in 2017 and then in Arizona in 2018, I have never seen a gubernatorial candidate take notes on anything or even admit that they don't know something. Yeah, so that is remarkable.
I heard that all the time from people who were saying like, yeah, we sat down and met and he got out a pad and paper and started asking me what I thought about things and writing it down. And it's kind of a difference from what you normally see. Fair, he probably didn't know. I mean, he wasn't in this world. He didn't know a lot of these answers, and probably still is learning quite a bit. So a couple of big things on his plate this week. One, a big group of bills that were signed this week. I'm not sure how much you've had a chance to kind of go through that. But anything that sticks out to you? I mean, last week or a couple of weeks ago, the big agency reform bills were I think the second one he signed. He signed the permitless carry was his first bill, but now a big batch of bills that he signed. Anything of note?
Nothing too remarkable. There was nothing controversial that he signed this week. He signed 14 bills, which is the most he's signed at one time. Altogether, he's signed 25. There are a couple smaller things, like one would have raised the number of days that substitute teachers could work during the school year. And then there was one that made schools offer sort of dyslexia awareness training for teachers. And then there were a couple other things here and there, but nothing too exciting.
Yeah, another big thing for him, too, is also putting his appointments. And so give us a kind of an update on kind of where things stand, because he's nominated a bunch of names, but not many have been confirmed by the Senate.
Right. So he's nominated 66 people, and I think altogether he has to nominate, or I think he nominates more than this, but 160 of his appointments will need to go through the Senate confirmation process. And so only 2 of those 66 that he's put up so far have been confirmed. And one is Blaine Arthur, who is the Agriculture Secretary. And then the second one, I asked about this earlier today because I legitimately didn't know, is Tim Gatz, the Secretary of Transportation. Those are the only 2 that have been confirmed. And so the Senate has Senate President Pro Tem Greg Treat, he said yesterday that expect to see more of those confirmations going through in the coming weeks, because basically he called for a working group, a bipartisan group, to study how the Senate could be more on top of their game when they're interviewing these nominees and when they're vetting these nominees. And so the recommendations from that work group came in yesterday. He's looking them over, and then they're basically going to revamp the whole confirmation process. And what he sort of explained to reporters yesterday is that they're going to do a lot more sort of behind the scenes, and that these nominees are going to have to meet with Senate leaders. They're going to have to meet with members of the panel or the committee that their confirmation will go through, and they'll do that all before it goes to committee and then goes to the floor.
So more thorough vetting is kind of what he'd like to see. About a month ago or several weeks ago, he had been talking about this at the beginning of the session, that he wanted to be more thorough in that process. And so a lot of reporters wanted to go to a committee meeting that was going to have some of these nominees before. The nominees weren't present. No questions were asked, or at least one of the nominees weren't present. No questions were asked of the one that was there. It was a unanimous, just kind of rubber stamp pass through. A couple days later, the pro tem, during one of his media avails, was asked about this, and you could tell he was visibly frustrated. Did not know that was the case, but Senator Treat is sometimes he doesn't hide his frustration, that well, and you could tell he's really frustrated that wasn't the intention that he had with this kind of new plan and new proposal. So I'm sure the governor's office would say, hey, that's fine, be more thorough. We feel confident in the people we put forward. I don't think there's a risk that they're going to see a lot of rejections or maybe any rejections, but there is kind of a deadline to this, or at least a timeline to this. What's their response to kind of the Senate's desire to be more thorough in this process?
Governor Stitt's spokeswoman, Donnell Harder, basically told me they're cautiously optimistic. And I don't think they're as worried about, the Senate dealing with all these appointees. I think they're more worried about if the Senate does reject some of these nominations, then the governor's office has to go back to the drawing board, and they have to figure out somebody new to name in their place. And if, it's the third week in May and session ends on May 31st, that doesn't leave them a lot of time to do this.
Yeah. That's a lot of stuff that's got to get done. Some in the past has just kind of looked at as housekeeping, but the Senate trying to reevaluate that process. Well, another thing that's going on, you're actually going to be at this tonight, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit more in detail in our next episode. But the state GOP convention is being held this weekend in Moore, Oklahoma, and Governor Stitt will speak at that convention. His first time as governor. He is the unofficial leader of the Republican Party in Oklahoma. For a guy that has not necessarily been overly partisan in his past, hadn't really participated in elections as a voter or as a candidate for the last several years. I'm curious, any expectations you have on what you might see him in his address to the state GOP tonight?
I'm just fascinated. I'm curious what he will say. I mean, it seems like Republicans like him. They like what he's done, already as governor. And so I don't think there's any sort of questioning about having him as basically one of the major faces of the state GOP. But, I'm just curious how he handles the state party infrastructure and all that comes with being a part of the state party, because it's just that it's complicated. I'm not explaining it very well.
No, I get what you're saying there. And there is a, there's kind of a verbiage and a, it's a very partisan world. Politics is very partisan. I mean, he's going to one of the most partisan places, a party convention. And he has continued to say that he is a nonpartisan guy. Now, don't get me wrong. He's very conservative. I mean, and so when push comes to shove, he's going to fall on the Republican side. There's not really a danger there that he's not going to, carry the Republicans' water. I mean, the first bill he signed was the permitless carry bill, championed by Republicans. But it'll be interesting to see kind of how he speaks to them. What kind of language does he use? Does he, so much of him talking has been that I'm not a partisan guy. Tonight will maybe be his most partisan speech, maybe.
Right. Does all of that that facade sort of fall away, and does he really embrace his Republican Party bona fides here and now at the state convention? And then, you also have to think ahead. So I think in January I covered Arizona's GOP state convention, and the big talk of the town there was electing somebody who would put, re-electing Trump at the forefront. So I think at the state convention this weekend, there's going to be a lot of talk about, re-electing Donald Trump, what the party needs to do to re-elect Donald Trump and maintain GOP gains in Oklahoma or, the clear GOP majority.
Yeah. A lot of times when he spoke, he has, like I said, he has talked about kind of wanting to be nonpartisan and bringing people together. He kind of jokes that he doesn't know much about the partisan infrastructure. There was a bill signing for the agency reform bills. And a reporter asked, why are there no Democrats standing behind you? And he joked and said, I don't even know if people are Republicans or Democrats. I mean, I'm sure he does. His staff will be happy to tell him who's which. But the point was that, hey, I'm not concerned with that stuff. I'm just trying to bring people to the table. Now, that often seems like kind of a hit against Democrats when you're standing with a group of Republicans and saying, I'm just trying to bring everyone together. Well, you obviously have the Republicans on your side. The Democrats are understandably not there. So will he deliver a bipartisan message to a group of Republicans? Will he say, hey, we need to work together. We need to work with our friends on the other side of the aisle. We need to, it's not about, he says this often. I'm curious, you can tell me whether he says this tonight. He often says, it's not about being urban or rural. It's not about being Democrat or Republican. Can you say that at a Republican convention?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you could try, and I guess if you're governor of the state, then you can get away with pretty much anything, but I don't think that message is going to go over well. I think now's the time when he has to be a team player, and he's on Team Republican Party.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that almost anywhere. I mean, you can say that at the inauguration where you've got a dominant Republican crowd in front of you, but everyone's gathering this weekend, like you said, for the Republican Party, for that team. And in May, the Democrats will do the same for their party. They're not there to hear this bipartisan message. This is game planning and how do we, go on the offensive against our political opponents.
Exactly.
So for 1 week in the books, anything already on the radar for next week, or what are some big policy issues we can look for? The bills in the legislature have already passed from their House of Origin or their floor of origin, are now in the other chamber. So that bill work is continuing. But anything else kind of major on the plate for the Capitol in the weeks to come?
I've been trying to sort of get a better handle on sort of what the governor's legislative priorities are and some of his criminal justice reform issues. And I think that's going to be a big issue coming up, both in the budget and the House and the Senate and the governor's office. I think a lot of them want to see criminal justice reform, but when you talk about criminal justice reform, there's so much that can be talked about, and so it's a matter of paring it down, what is doable, and then of course education is always going to be a big focus, and so it's a matter of obviously the governor wants to give teachers more money and wants to devote more money to education, and it's a matter of how much are this House and Senate going to be willing to give. So I'll keep watching that, of course.
Yeah. Yes. And so the details of the budget negotiations, once those start coming out, maybe hopefully here in the next several days or a couple of weeks, will be really interesting, because there is, the Republican House and Senate and the Republican governor seem to be on the same page for the most part. You mentioned education funding. The governor's budget has a teacher pay raise, but not more money for classroom funding. Both the House and the Senate have said that's going to be important to them. Is he willing to give on that? How much of a, not a sacred cow, but how much of a pressing point is that for him to not put money into the classroom? I don't think he's against it. I just think he has other priorities. So is he going to be willing to give there? And it's also important to note as we wrap up, a year ago here in Oklahoma, we were in the middle of a 2-week teacher strike. And you know something a little bit about that too. Arizona had its own demonstration, and it was last year, right? The teacher. Yeah. When was it? What time?
I think it was around the same time Oklahoma went on strike.
Okay, were you there yet?
Yes,
okay.
I was there. And the fun part was that Governor Doug Ducey was up for re-election, and so the teachers in the state of, I shouldn't say all teachers, but many of the teachers in the state of Arizona basically wanted his head on a spike, and they wanted, significant raises, more money for classrooms, more money for those who work in schools but aren't teachers.
Support staff, yeah.
Yes. And so, frankly, it's interesting to see here that there's that the legislature and the governor are so amenable to giving more to teachers after what they did last year. Whereas in Arizona, I don't think Governor Ducey is planning any sort of additional raises for the teachers except what he's already promised. I don't think. And then the legislature is debating all these bills that are basically retaliation efforts on the teachers for going on strike.
In Arizona.
Yeah. But
okay.
Oklahoma seems...
There were some that were filed, but they didn't really get any traction.
Yeah.
And so that is interesting to see. And we've seen that not just in Arizona and a few other states. And
I saw similar sort of efforts in West Virginia that they're going back after the teachers. And maybe I shouldn't word it that way, but, I kind of wonder how much Governor Stitz' influence is playing into all of this because, he has sort of promised more for the teachers, and he did so throughout the campaign trail. And so maybe that's why things are quieted down on the education front, because teachers want to see what he does for them this year before they get angry again or get on his side, I guess.
Yeah, well, and last year, during the walkout, which came after a pay raise, the focus of the walkout was on classroom funding. Stitt and some of the other candidates said that they supported a pay raise. They didn't necessarily support the tax increases to do it here, or what we saw last year. I've said before, that was kind of maybe on Stitt's part. Maybe it was a misreading of the walkout, or maybe he just thought, hey, the teacher pay is something that I can really convince all Oklahomans to get behind, because teachers were frustrated when he was saying, I'm for more, another teacher pay raise. And the teachers at the Capitol were saying, that's great. We just got a raise. That's not why we're walking out now. We'll take it, definitely, and it's important, but that's not the main focus. And so some people criticize the governor for kind of having a misreading of the walkout. That could be true. I also think he's not playing up to just the teachers. He's playing up to all voters, and he was playing up to Republican voters in a contested primary. So, but you're right, though. There's been grumbling from educators. There hasn't been a massive demonstration at the Capitol. There's been some frustration expressed from the teachers union and stuff, but not it doesn't seem as adversarial as it did in years past. Part of that may be because the budget here is actually growing. And I don't know, not being from Arizona, what if the budget was flat, going up or down, or whether it was tougher to put more money into the classroom there.
Yeah, they have a huge surplus this year. I think a lot of states do, and times are always good when there's more money. It's just when there's not that things turn bad.
Yeah. So I wouldn't say, when the budget, as the budget negotiations continue, as we start to see more of those details, if classroom funding, isn't getting a significant increase, it will be interesting to see how the education community responds to that. Things could get pretty dicey. But so far from both the House and the Senate, they say that their plan is to put more money into the funding formula. We'll just have to see how the governor responds to that. So, well, hey, Carmen, great job on your first episode.
Thank you.
Episode 1 of many to come, and welcome again to Oklahoma City and the Oklahoman. Glad to have you. And we'll be looking forward to following your reporting.
Thank you. I guess I'll come back on the podcast. This is okay.
Pretty harmless. Yeah, right. Yeah. So that's going to do it for this week's episode of Political State. You can find this in every episode on your favorite podcast app, also on YouTube. I'm Ben Felder with the Oklahoman. New co-host Carmen with me. We'll see you again next week.